One of the most controversial phrases in the Declaration of Independence is this idea that all men are created equal. Why is it that the Declaration of Independence instead says created equal? They're not just born free, they're not just born equal, they're in fact created equal. Because these two different philosophies, one of them basing our rights in God, the other one basing them purely in man, these ideas lead to very different political conceptions of what our rights are. Twenty 2026 is America's 250th birthday as an independent country. It is our semiquincentennial, which means halfway to 500 years. And throughout the year, we will have numerous occasions to revisit the Declaration of Independence and indeed the context of our revolutionary forefathers, both the ideas that they were fighting for and also the actions they took in forwarding and making practical those ideas of the Declaration of Independence and indeed of the revolution itself. I wanted to start, however, by talking about a couple of terms that one finds in the Declaration of Independence and what they mean in the context of their own time, but also philosophically and for all time. Now, before I begin by talking about the Declaration, let me first address the term revolution itself. We think of the American Revolution, and yet the American Revolution seems so different from, for example, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, which brings about, the rise to power of the Bolsheviks and the creation of the Soviet Union. Is the American Revolution a revolution like the French and the Russian revolutions? Is it a revolution like the revolutions that came to Europe in 1848? Which is when you had a number of uprisings throughout continental Europe, where you had, in many cases, radical left or socialist elements trying to take power in Europe. Revolution is generally something that is seen as being a rather left-wing idea in general in the world of the 21st century. But that wasn't how it was seen at the time of the American Revolution, and it's not how it was seen at the time of the Glorious Revolution, which was a century or so earlier. So the Glorious Revolution is in 1688 and 1689, and that is the moment when basically the British Parliament declares that King James II has abdicated, and now Parliament is going to invite in Mary and her husband William of Orange to come and take the throne of England as William III and Queen Mary II, I should say. That is a revolution, not because it has a left-wing objective, although, the relatively more liberal or, as we might now say, progressive side of the Glorious Revolution was indeed driving a lot of the action. But it was really seen by the British as not being a radical transformation of the political system. It was seen as not being an overturning of the proper form of government of England. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, 1689 was considered to be a revolution in the sense that a circle or a wheel revolves and goes in a 360-degree circle, starting at one point and coming around back to where it began. In the same way, the idea of a political revolution in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689, and then subsequently in the American Revolution in 1776, this is a return back to the origins, as they are understood philosophically, of the regime in the first place. So in the 17th century, and then going on into the 18th century when we have our own revolution, there was an idea, which one can certainly find in the philosopher John Locke in his two treatises of politics, but also one can find it in a number of other thinkers as well. This notion that all governments find their original source of authority on this earth, under God. They find their original source of earthly authority in the people, and that it's the people who are ultimately responsible for whatever kind of regime a government may have, whatever form constitutionally that it might take as a state. And this is so even if you have, for example, a monarchy, the idea is that ultimately even a monarchy must depend on a certain amount of legitimacy from the people in order to be functional and in order to have legitimacy. And certainly it is true with respect to more parliamentary, or as we might now in the 21st century say, more democratic forms of government. The idea being that ultimately all power derives on this earth from the people, whether that's a monarchy, whether it's an aristocracy, or indeed whether it's a democracy, and whether it's a mixed system overall. So the Glorious Revolution was about Parliament. Parliament basically asserting the rights of the English people to return their government to its original form by basically filling in what they considered to be a deposed king, James II, filling that vacancy on the throne by having William and Mary come in and become the king and queen. So it was a restoration in a sense. A revolution was in fact a return, a 360-degree revolving back to the healthy condition of the government through the fact that the people, through their instrumentality of Parliament, and through the restoration of the monarchy as well, that they were coming back to the healthy original form of the Constitution. Now, you might think that the American Revolution would be different from that, because isn't the American Revolution really a dramatic change in political form, because you are breaking away from a monarchy, you're creating a number of independent states, which will then be coordinated through the Continental Congress and other institutions, and will ultimately go on in the 1780s in order to create the United States Constitution and a more perfect union, a more complete nation out of these independent states. Well, even in the American context, there is a sense in which the American Revolution is indeed a return. It's a return of power back to the people after the king has lost their trust, lost their confidence, and has therefore lost legitimacy. So Americans came over, in fact, Englishmen came over to the Americas as colonists who had been given charters that came from the king. It was the king who was responsible for providing royal charters, which then brought colonists over to the New World, to the Americas, and to North America in particular. This meant that the colonists felt as if they had a direct tie to the king. They did not have a direct tie to Parliament because, of course, they didn't elect Parliament. They didn't have a right to vote for Parliament. But likewise, it wasn't really Parliament that was primarily making laws for the American colonies. The American colonies soon set up, legislatures and other forms of government of their own, by royal permission. So the king was always, the superintending authority who, first of all, allowed Englishmen to go over and colonize North America to begin with, and who then provided royal charters for the government of the colonies. It was the king, therefore, with whom the American people, as they develop in the New World, in the Americas, in North America, it was the king with whom they felt they had a political attachment and an allegiance, an attachment of loyalty. It was not to Parliament. And of course, once Parliament starts legislating more and more for the American colonies in the 1760s and into the 1770s, Americans start to ask themselves, well, wait a minute, don't we have our own legislatures that were given to us and approved by the king? How can it be that the Parliament is now coming in and saying that it gets to not only speak for us, but in fact gets to impose taxes and otherwise regulate our lives here in America? And think about this too. The British Empire, as it had sort of newly formed at this point, it was a fairly recent creation of about, a century or so old, and it's only at the beginning of the 18th century that you find England and Scotland, which had previously been in a union of crowns. So Scotland and England had the same monarch, but they were not politically unified until the early part of the 18th century. At that point, you have an act of union which brings together and unites the Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament into one combined British Parliament, which in fact is basically a continuation of the English Parliament. So the British Empire and Britain itself was actually composed of a number of different political and even national elements. So the Scottish and the English, even to this day, are separate peoples. And even though they have a single united government, it's still the case that Scotland has a number of laws of its own, but also the Scottish people very much do not think of themselves as being English because they aren't English, and Englishmen don't think of themselves as being Scottish because they aren't Scottish. They are together British in a sense, but even British is a label which is kind of secondary both to the English and to the Scots. And of course, over the course of history, you also have Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom of today. You also, much earlier in history, you had Wales annexed to England. And even though Wales is a component part of England now, the Welsh still have a certain amount of their own self-identity and even a limited amount of political autonomy within the United Kingdom. And keep in mind as well that by the time we get to the American Revolution, you have the Elector of Hanover, who's also sitting on the British throne. So, the House of Hanover, George I and the II and the III, these are originally princes within Germany. They are in charge of the German state of Hanover. And they are invited over, George I is invited over, to fill a vacancy on the English throne because he is the next closest heir in line to the throne according to the principles of heredity, according to the bloodline, who is a Protestant, which is the key thing. There are, perhaps better claimants based on the legitimacy of blood who are Catholic and who are in Europe. But that is a problem for the Church of England. It's a problem for the English in general. They want to have a Protestant monarch upon the throne. So it is, to the next closest Protestant of the bloodline, which winds up being the Elector of Hanover, George I, who is taken over and becomes the King of England after Queen Anne in the 18th century. So the British Empire is already a combination of mixed peoples of different kinds. And the King of England, the King of Britain as well, winds up also having this, state in Germany. And now the state of Hanover is not incorporated into the United Kingdom. It's not part of Britain. The Hanoverians are not British, but they do have the same monarch as the British, and that is this House of Hanover, the Georges. The Americans develop a sense of themselves as a people, partly based on geography. They are ancestrally mostly Englishmen, but they are living in America. And it is a natural thing that the geographic designation American ultimately becomes a demonym as well. It ultimately becomes the name for the people who are living in America. So Americans already start developing a sense that, they're not Englishmen. They have the rights of Englishmen because they have inherited those rights from their forefathers, but they're not Englishmen themselves. They are actually Americans. And similarly, some of them might come from Scotland, but they're not Scots either. They're not living in Scotland. Their ties to Scotland have been attenuated, just as the, English descendants have had their ties to England attenuated. They are instead already thinking of themselves as Americans. So the revolution, and the word revolution, is a reclamation on the part of a people, and this is now a people which is the American people. It is the reclamation of their full political authority to determine for themselves what kind of government they're going to have. And they decide that, they can no longer be annexed to a separate people, which is the British and the English subjects in particular of King George III. And they also no longer accept George III as their ruler, not because they're trying to change, the nature of, not because they're saying, a monarchy is always bad and you have to have, a republic. It's rather that the King of England in particular, as the man who is responsible for the American colonies and therefore the American people, the King of England, the King of Great Britain, has betrayed the trust of the people. And, the Declaration of Independence spells out this long list of grievances and wicked acts by the king, which has negated his claim to be a just ruler, and therefore has created conditions in which the American people must reclaim the right that a people naturally has to form its own political arrangements. And that includes by saying, okay, the king is no longer our king. We now have our own institutions here in North America. We're going to, vindicate them through war. We're going to win our independence. And then ultimately, we're going to use the power that we have as a people that is united in order to create a new constitutional order for ourselves. And that, of course, is the United States Constitution. So it is a revolution, not in the sense of the French Revolution or the revolutions of 1848 or the Russian Revolution. Instead, it's a revolution much in the same sense as 1688 or 1689 in England, where you have a restoration of the rights of the people to form their own constitutional order. And this was something that Englishmen and subsequently Americans believed was a very deep-seated right, not just based on Lockean philosophy as spelled out in John Locke's second treatise, but in fact was something that they believed history itself had long proven. So Thomas Jefferson in particular was one of the American leaders who very much believed that the liberties not only of Americans, but before them the liberties of Englishmen, ultimately go all the way back to the forests of Germany. Of course, England itself takes its name from the Angles, one of the German tribes who come over after the collapse of Roman power in Britain and settle England and basically, create a new political order and a new people in the country which formerly had been Britain, and now it becomes, the southern part of it becomes England as a result of settlement by the Angles. And of course, the Angles are also joined by Saxons and a handful of other Germanic groups. Thomas Jefferson believed that the basic form of government of the Germanic peoples was elected kingship. And that elected kingship also involved a component where the king would have a council that was basically, that certainly drew its authority, its moral authority, from the people as a whole. And therefore, Thomas Jefferson actually believed that there was a deep ancestry in German history, basically, for the idea that the people ultimately have power and the political authorities, whether they are a king or whether they are a republican form of government, they owe their legitimacy and they owe their authority to the people. So that is something that, should be kept in mind as we think about, 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. It's not just about Lockean philosophy and the second treatise of government. It's also this idea that England has an ancient constitution which had always supposedly recognized the fundamental power of the people to create their own institutions and their own government. Now, I should say that this is all a little bit mythological. That this idea that there was, this antique, ancient, sort of early medieval German popular freedom to, have elected kings and to have, a council that was thinking of itself as representative of the people. It's not entirely untrue, but it also isn't exactly correct either. So basically, it was not a formal democracy of any kind. It was not something where, the tribesmen of the Angles as a nation had, the power to directly elect a king, or that kings had to defer to councils. It was a much more complicated scheme than that. And in any event, of course, with the Norman conquest of England in 1066, you then have a very different kind of political order, the Norman political order, that is imposed on England. Now, this was something that, had been very much on Thomas Jefferson's mind. One of the things that Thomas Jefferson and a variety of other thinkers, both in America and also in England, thought was that the Norman conquest of England in 1066 was a kind of perversion of history. It was a diversion away from the proper course of, traditional ancient English liberty, ancient Germanic liberty, and instead, in the direction of what they called the Norman yoke, and the idea that the Normans established something that was a less free political order than the one that the Angles and the Saxons had naturally or historically had for themselves. So there too, you can see that there's a sense of a revolution as a restoration. In this case, in the case of Whig mythology, it is a restoration of the original power of the Germanic peoples to create their own modes of government. And this is seen as not only being something that is particular to the Germanic peoples, but that also has been outlined philosophically by John Locke in his second treatise. So that's the nature of revolution as most Americans understand it in 1776. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button and please share this with your friends and with anyone you think would benefit from learning about conservative ideas and the ideas of America's own founding philosophy. You can also find Modern Age online at www.modernagejournal.com, and you can find us in print every 3 months as a quarterly journal published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And I guarantee that if you subscribe to Modern Age as a print publication, you will find it to be an absolutely elevating and intellectually stimulating experience every time. I want to talk, however, about a couple of other terms that one finds very early on in the Declaration of Independence. Now, one of the most inspiring but also most controversial phrases in the Declaration of Independence is this idea that all men are created equal. And Oftentimes, the both inspiration and the controversy centers around the word equal. Because are, in fact, human beings equal? Was it a novel doctrine to say in 1776 that all men are created equal? Didn't, in fact, most of Western civilization depend earlier on this idea that there were, in fact, levels, that there were natural-born kings and aristocrats who were very different from the commoners? Isn't it the case, as you go forward, that you can find that people have, vast differences of natural talent and natural ability, and therefore you can't say that they are created equal? Rather infamously, in the 19th century, so several decades after the American Revolution, you will have John C. Calhoun, a senator and later vice president, who is a major thinker and is a very controversial thinker because he's quite pro-slavery. John C. Calhoun will say, well, you know what, the Declaration of Independence, wonderful flowery rhetoric, but in fact it is predicated on something that is basically an untrue philosophy, precisely because it says all men are created equal. John C. Calhoun points out, not only are people unequal, but they're not created. They're actually born. Everyone is born into a family. A family already has a hierarchy. Children are not equal with their parents. Children are, in fact, fully dependent on their parents. Parents naturally have a great deal more authority than their children have. Now, this actually kind of replicates, or at least it retraces an argument that had been made, 200 years earlier, basically, in the 17th century, by the critics of John Locke and by the other line of philosophy which was against Lockean constitutionalism. That's a line of philosophy that traces its thought to a man named Robert Filmer. And Filmer argued that, in fact, hierarchy is natural, and the family is natural, and because the family is natural, kingship is also natural, and that kingship is basically, the political analog to the natural power that a father has within the family. And Filmer points to the Bible as being a religious sanction for this. So he's not only talking about the family as he sees it as a natural institution, but also this is something that has been divinely ordained. Now, in the 19th century, John C. Calhoun is not invoking the Bible. He's not invoking a divine ordinance of the family. If anything, there is, a kind of a little bit of almost social Darwinism, a little bit ahead of the calendar there. Before social Darwinism has fully formed, you can already find in someone like John C. Calhoun some of these ideas that will later flourish and develop into social Darwinism. And it's precisely in this idea that human beings have natural differences in their capacities. And again, simply looking at the family as a natural element, you can see that it has an intrinsic hierarchy. And if there's an intrinsic hierarchy there, if people are not, in fact, neither created nor are they equal, then perhaps the entire Declaration of Independence collapses, and you have to find a different basis for American freedom. And perhaps, in the case of John C. Calhoun, he's using these arguments in order to argue for, to justify slavery, basically. Now, it seems to me that there is an important misreading of the Declaration of Independence that is involved here. So, when John C. Calhoun says that that man is not created equal, and he, says that man is not created in the first place, human beings are born, and he says, and they're certainly not equal in terms of their natural endowments. They're not equal in terms of their inheritances, from the world either. So some people are born into wealth and riches. Other people are born into poverty, so they're not equal in that respect either. But even in terms of their natural inborn abilities, they differ from one another quite substantially. And again, they're born into a hierarchy of the family. What I want to focus on, though, is not a defense of equality, which is a big question and something we'll get into over the course of 2026, and is, an ongoing debate about just what equality means in the Declaration of Independence. I want to focus instead on the word created. What does it mean to say that man is created and that men are created, human beings are created? Now, why does the Declaration say, all men are created equal? Why doesn't it say all men are born equal? You will, find other political philosophies. You will find Rousseau and Marx and others who have this idea that, human beings are born free, but for some reason they are immediately enslaved after being born, either because of their class position or because of the social institutions in general into which they are born. So there is this idea that maybe men could be born free, agree. Why is it that the Declaration of Independence instead says they're not just born free, they're not just born equal, they're in fact created equal? And of course, the Declaration goes on to say they are endowed by their Creator with their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why this emphasis on creation? Well, it's something you also find to some degree in John Locke's second treatise, and it's precisely because these are arguments that are being framed in a broadly, and I stress broadly, Christian framework. Now, John Locke himself was thought in his own time to be what was called a Socinian. A Socinian is basically a Unitarian, so definitely not, a Christian who is adhering to, Trinitarian orthodoxy. Many of our own founding fathers, whether it's Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, they too are not really models of Christian orthodoxy, and they too oftentimes have Unitarian leanings. And if you look at the context of the Declaration of Independence, there certainly is, the fact that Jefferson is the one who's primarily drafting the Declaration of Independence. There certainly is an influence, which is often called deistic, but in many cases it's actually Unitarian. But there is this sense that it's not, quite a fully Christian document. But if you say that, you also have to take the flip side into consideration, which is even if it may not seem to be fully Christian or fully orthodox in terms of Christianity, it certainly is not fully unchristian either. The Declaration of Independence is not a document that can be understood separate from the idea of God as a creator, because it's precisely the idea of God as the creator of the world and of human beings within it which makes the whole idea of rights possible. So these are not human rights that, have been developed over the course of the 20th century using a Kantian framework. So Immanuel Kant, takes a view of the human mind and human nature from which, later thinkers derive various theories of rights that are quite different, in fact, from the idea of rights that you find even in John Locke and certainly in the Declaration of Independence, which is an idea of rights as basically a gift from God. And these are natural rights still because God has, of course, created nature. But if you take that creator out of it, the whole thing collapses. You no longer have, rights. You no longer have equality. When the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, this is actually the Christian doctrine that the immortal human soul is not a product simply of biology. The immortal human soul is something that God actually individually creates. And in that sense, we are all, created souls that are created by God. And God wishes to see us, first of all, He gives us life to begin with. And if He gives us life, that means that we have our life properly, that, we have not stolen life from God. We have been given life by God. And therefore, God has given us this wonderful gift. And therefore, we have a right to this gift. God has assigned us the right to have a life, and He has given us that life. And then from that right to life, there follows the right to property to begin with, because, of course, in order to live, you have to have food and you have to have shelter. This doesn't mean, by the way, that you therefore have to have state provision of food or shelter. That certainly was not the way that either John Locke or America's founding fathers looked at things. The idea that you have a right to acquire property, this is an individual right that can be expressed in any number of institutional arrangements. And the one that both John Locke and our founding fathers thought was the best arrangement was precisely private property. And the defense of private property is something that goes back centuries before John Locke as a fundamental human right. It's something, in fact, that medieval popes had weighed in on and said, yes, in fact, there was property even in the Garden of Eden. So even in a state of perfect innocence, there would still be such a thing as property, and it would still be important to human beings. So property as a natural right, a God-given natural right, the right to acquire property, is something that has pre-Lockean roots, and again, is a natural right that is given to us by God. And again, there's no conflict between saying something is a natural right and saying it's God-given. And because we have the right to life and we also have the right to acquire property, there follows this question about the right to liberty and equal liberty in particular. Now, we have a right to liberty because, of course, if you are a slave, if you are not free, this means that somebody else has total power not only over you, but also over your property. It means someone has total power over your life and death, and it means that someone else, has total power over whether or not you're going to eat, whether or not you're going to get food. Now, not in all circumstances throughout, world history has slavery always meant that there is supreme power on the part of the slave owner. It doesn't always mean that owners have the right to kill their slaves, for example. Slaves have had rights in various, ancient frameworks and in other circumstances. But in general, to say that you're going to have slavery means that you're going to have an enormous amount of power wielded over both the life and the property of other people, the people who are your slaves. Well, God is not making people slaves to begin with. God is, in fact, giving everyone their life. Because he gives them their life, he is also implicitly giving them a right to acquire the means necessary to the sustenance of their life, which means the right to acquire property, the right to acquire food and shelter in particular. And it also means that there is a right to liberty, a certain right to freedom. Because if they didn't have that right to freedom, if they were not free to begin with, that means they would be entirely, their lives and their property, things that God has given to them, would instead be entirely co-opted by another human being. So that would be a theft on the part of another human being of the rights that God has properly given to the individual human being. So there is obviously a very grave difficulty for any kind of slavery when you have this doctrine of natural rights that you find, God-given natural rights within the Declaration of Independence. Now, if you go to John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, written about a century before the Declaration of Independence, you'll see that John Locke gives a complicated quasi-defense of slavery. And I won't get into the details now. John Locke says that, slavery is not part of the state of nature, so it's not something that natural rights create. Instead, Locke says that slavery is a continuation of the state of war. So just as in war you have a right to kill your opponent, John Locke says, well, look, if your alternative is you either kill your opponent or you can enslave your opponent, it might make sense that your opponent would accept slavery over being killed. So he says, well, you could kind of have a development of slavery through that mechanism, through the state of war rather than the state of nature. And Locke goes on to say that, well, what this means, though, is you can't ever really have peace with your slaves, and therefore you can't make contracts with them, you can't treat them as quasi-free and quasi-slave, because if you do that, then you're admitting that they're actually free people, they're no longer in a state of war with you, and then your slavery would be unjust. So on the one hand, there are people who defend John Locke and who say that Locke has actually described slavery in such a way that it can't possibly be legitimate, that in fact it is described in a way that is self-contradictory and therefore collapses. There are others who take a less generous interpretation of John Locke and who say that, Locke is indeed saying that there is this, sort of other framework that is not, the rights of, nature, but that in fact are the rights of war, which is a very different set of conditions. And war is not something necessarily God-given. War is something that human beings have created and that creates a whole different set of institutions and a whole different set of options. John Locke, by the way, so one thing that you'll often see defenders of Locke say is, again, that Locke's conditions for having just slavery are impossible to obtain in the real world, and therefore Locke must necessarily be against slavery. Of course, one of the rebuttals that one can offer is everything John Locke says in the Second Treatise is rather unrealistic. So Locke, takes literally this idea that there is a social contract and that people will come together and create governments and create regimes. He's not using that figuratively the way that Thomas Hobbes before him had. John Locke actually said whenever he was questioned about this, that he means literally you have to have an actual, performative social contract. And of course, none of the governments that existed in John Locke's own lifetime in the 17th century adhered to this form of having, government created through, a social contract. And what that implies is that if you take Locke very seriously, then Locke is actually quite radical and is saying there is no legitimate government in the entire planet, on the entire world, during his own lifetime, because none of them have been created by social contract. All the governments of John Locke's own lifetime have been created ultimately through the conditions of war. And so the inequalities and even the slavery that you see extant in the world of the 17th century, Locke might say, is because you're actually living under the dispensation of war and conquest and inequality, rather than the dispensation of nature and God, and nature's God, of course, which is a dispensation of equality and liberty and natural rights. So I think these texts are fascinating, and to actually understand them and to go and look at the arguments that they're really making is it's eye-opening, and it goes to show that these thinkers from hundreds of years ago are in fact much more sophisticated than we realize. And now I'll take us forward again and just speak about John C. Calhoun. And I said that in some ways Calhoun seems to be anticipating this later development of social Darwinism, and you could say that social Darwinism in some ways goes back to this Lockean idea, not the Lockean idea of natural rights, but rather the Lockean idea of the state of war as an alternative to the state of nature. And of course, social Darwinism and Darwinism in general tends to say that actually the state of nature is not a God-given condition. So the state of nature is not the state that is given by nature's God, because Darwinism and social evolution, these don't take God into consideration. They are generally there's certainly secular theories, and they're often theories that are very much connected with atheism. Well, if that's the case, and the way in which Darwinists and social Darwinists both describe nature, a godless nature, is that this godless nature is based on competition, and that it is in fact extremely fierce. It's partly based on sexual competition. It's partly based on the competition of tooth and claw as to who survives and is able to pass on their genes. And you might say that basically what develops in the course of the 19th century, certainly with Darwinism and social Darwinism, but even in some cases before, before Darwin has written the On the Origin of Species, you already have this idea that nature is fundamentally not God-given, and nature is fundamentally identical with the state of war. So there you can find these two Lockean ideas, the state of nature and the state of war, where in fact the state of nature, once you take God out of it, is no longer a natural state of equality, a natural state of liberty, of a right to life, and of a right to property and to pursuit of happiness. Instead, nature as of the 19th century is simply a bloody competition for survival. And that, of course, means both sexual competition, but also competition for scarce resources, which, of course, that has economic implications as well as social Darwinian implications. And it's just an entirely different philosophy, an entirely different point of view, which gets you to a very different set of political and social institutions. So one of the key things that we have to look at in the year 2026, as we look back 250 years to the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and to the American Revolution and the American founding, is this idea that we were founded as a country. You can debate just how much influence a kind of Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity had on the American Revolution and on the Constitution and our founding fathers, because there is a strong element of that, and then there are also elements that are Unitarian or they're in conflict with that Orthodox Trinitarianism. But nevertheless, the whole thing depends upon the idea of God as the creator, not only of the world, but also of man, and that as the creator of the world and man, God has given the world to man. He has given us the ability to acquire property. He has given us a right to freedom. He has given us the right to have our own lives. And we can then, based on the rights that he has given us, use those rights to come together as a people and assert the power of a people, to use our rights in combination to establish a government, or to sever our connection in the case of the American Revolution, to sever our connection with another people and with another form of government, and to stand on our own 2 feet as an independent people who are going to create governments of their own in the states, and then ultimately come together, to go beyond the Articles of Confederation and to create, a more perfect union in the form of the United States Constitution. Now, in the course of, the next 100 years, by the time we get to the 19th century, especially, the middle and the end of the 19th century, Americans have already lost sight of their own founding principles. And, during the course of 2026, I'll have occasion to bring up some examples of Abraham Lincoln and others warning about the loss of our fundamental principles, which we understood at the time of the American Revolution, but which by the middle of the 19th century we had already lost. And in fact, we had lost them in such a profound way, we didn't even remember what we had lost. You could have John C. Calhoun, who was a very intelligent man. John C. Calhoun is one of the most brilliant political theorists of his era. And yet he doesn't seem to understand the Christian creationist argument on which the Declaration of Independence is based. He's viewing the Declaration of Independence only from the lens of 19th century science and the idea that, if you look at the world of the empirical world of the 19th century, it's a world in which, human beings are not created because God has already started to slip out of the picture. And instead, you only understand human beings as being born into particular social environments, born into families, born into conditions of inequality, and born with unequal attributes, biological attributes as human beings, unequal talents, unequal ingenuity. Whereas the kind of equality that had been so essential to the American founding, to the Revolution, to the Declaration of Independence, that was an equality of created souls created by God. So this is a fundamental thing to understand as we start to think about, in our semiquincentennial, as we start to think about what it would mean to recover the ideas of the American founding and of the Declaration of Independence in particular. We're going to have to start by understanding that there is a theological component to the American Declaration of Independence, and that in fact it's only in the 19th century, but pretty early, unfortunately, in the 19th century, that this theological understanding of the Declaration of Independence is completely fallen by the wayside, and instead you already get to get a biological and materialistic and secular understanding of America's political institutions, and those forms of understanding these institutions are incompatible with equality, and they are in fact antithetical to the very thing that our founding fathers were trying to establish. We'll discuss a little bit later in future podcasts how, even when we talk about rights in the 21st century, these are often rights that are not understood the way the Founding Fathers understood rights and the way that rights are conveyed in the Declaration of Independence, but instead after not only the 19th century, but also after World War II, the idea of social Darwinism, the idea of inequality of individuals and inequality of the races, these ideas become extremely toxic. They are extremely unpopular at that point because of the Second World War and seeing what happens when the Nazis take these ideas of inequality to a murderous and genocidal extreme. So there is a rejection in the United Nations and among the elites of the triumphant Western allies in World War II. There is a rejection of the kind of social Darwinism and biological inequality which had been such a hallmark of the 19th century. Unfortunately, though, in rejecting that kind of 19th century ideology of biological inequality, they do not go back to the older 18th century understanding of the rights that are outlined in the Declaration of Independence. Instead, you have again, I won't go into the details, but it is a new post-Kantian understanding of rights, which tries to ground rights not in the idea that we are the creations of God, and therefore we have to look to a creator God, to understand what our rights are and what their limitations are. Instead, now, in the 20th century and then into the 21st century, rights are understood as grounded purely in human cognition, purely in the way that we are as, human beings without God, basically. And there's a lot of fuzziness. You'll see, there's often, there are thinkers, especially on the left, but even some on the right, on the center right, who will basically continue to kind of try to fudge the difference between this post-Kantian idea of rights that are grounded in human beings just by themselves and without God being part of the picture, and an older idea of human rights as being given to us directly by God, and depending upon the existence of God in order to be valid. You will see some thinkers in the 20th century and the 21st century who try to blur the difference between those two philosophies. But that's very dangerous, because these two different philosophies, one of them basing our rights in God, the other one basing them purely in man, these ideas, these different philosophies lead to very different political conceptions of what our rights are. And this extravagant notion of rights that we see in the 21st century, where rights are often used against the family, and rights are often used against religion, and rights are often things that are invoked for the most radical left-wing causes, this is a development that's based on the kind of philosophy that is justifying rights in the 21st century. And it is a post-Kantian progressive philosophy that's doing that, rather than the traditional philosophy, which again, you can certainly find Lockean elements of it in the second treatise of government by John Locke. You can find it in the Declaration of Independence, but it's not just about John Locke. This idea that we are the creations of God is, of course, not a Lockean idea at all. It is a Christian idea. It is a Jewish idea before it's even Christian. It's an idea that, even Unitarians, Muslims, and others also embrace. It is a much, much older idea than the Enlightenment. It's a much older idea than liberalism. It's a much older idea than John Locke. And there follows a natural logic that if indeed God is the creator of man, what does God intend for man? What are the rights that God, having created us, as equal souls, what rights has he given us in order to have our lives, in order to be able to lead our lives, in order to sustain them with property? And then also what kinds of justice is due to us. And that's really where this idea of our souls being created equal enters into the picture. That's about equal justice. And even in times of just monarchy, there is an understanding that the monarch only has political power because he is responsible for ensuring that there is equal justice among his subjects. And it may be that his subjects have different privileges. Some of them may be aristocrats, some of them may be commoners, but yet justice is due to all of them, and it has to be justice that is in accord with God's gift of a certain amount of dignity and natural rights to every human being. The American Revolution is all about going back to a core which in fact is older than John Locke and is older than any Enlightenment notion, this idea that God is our creator, and there are certain things that follow logically and morally from the fact of God as our creator in terms of the rights that we have. This is, of course, going to become a very controversial idea, first in the 19th century, where you see a sudden vogue for materialism and sort of biological inequality. It's going to be a time when you see the idea of God-given natural rights collapse in the 19th century. Then in the 20th century and the 21st century, even though there is a rejection of biological inequality, there is an affirmation now of a very radical, purely human-centered notion of human rights derived from, our intellectual attributes and other things. And this is going to be, or for that matter, derived simply from assertions of political power and assertions of, moral authority by an institution like the United Nations. This is a very dangerous thing that has led us into so much of the chaos and confusion that characterizes the 21st century. In revisiting America's founding in our 250th birthday, we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence, look at the thought of our revolutionary forefathers and our founding fathers. We're going to recover what it was that allowed them to make a healthy political order, how that political order was then lost in the 19th century, and why it wasn't recovered in the 20th or the 21st century, but the time to recover it is now.